So my name is Chase Meusel. I'm a user researcher at Microsoft. I have a whole bunch of like weird personal stuff, if you want to talk, not that personal, but personal history about how I got into research. The very brief version is that I was a biology undergrad. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. Well, you know, you've probably heard these stories, right? But I was reading Wired because it had Halo 3 on the cover, and it was the art of the science of play is the name of the article. It's from 2008, I think, right? Pre-Halo 3. So I saw that. I'm like, oh, well, of course I need to read this about Halo. And when I got into it, the article was really about how you do research, user research within video games. And I was like, holy shit. People get paid to do research for video games? Because I can't program and I can't draw, so this sounds like a great avenue. So I go and I actually read the article, and I'm really intrigued. And I was looking for graduate programs, and I saw one. So I'm from Iowa, and there's not a lot of programs in Iowa. But at Iowa State University, we have a human-computer interaction program. Are you guys familiar with HCI? Okay, yeah, I see some nodding. UW has the HCDE program, which is pretty similar for sort of an analogous local program. I went to that open house for the Human Computer Interaction Lab, and they have the virtual reality lab within Iowa State. And so I was like, oh, shoot, virtual reality games. And the first demo I did was seated in the fake cockpit with a full swinging seat and turret for a Millennium Falcon demo where you're shooting at TIE fighters. Like, yep, I made it. This is the right place. So went through that program, and then I was fortunate to have our first graduate in our program that went to Microsoft, and she came back to speak at Iowa State. And so I was like, oh, well, now I have a connection. I should look into this. And so I followed that through. I interned at Microsoft in 2015, came back at the end of 2016, and it's been super fun. And I've just recently, actually, since I've met Phil and came to visit, I've transitioned from the Windows research team. So we have a big group of about 100 researchers. And for scale, I think that's the largest user research team in the world, like a centralized one. Most user research teams are pretty small if you have one. Otherwise, researchers are typically embedded within a product team. So you might be like the researcher who supports a particular thing. Like if you go to Google, they have multiple researchers within each item of G Suite, right? So that team is really big. And then I was able to have a position. I was fortunate enough to be able to apply for a position within Xbox research. So I've since moved, and I'm super pumped because gaming is my first love, and my boss is now the dude who the article was about in the Halo 3 Wired article. So that's full circle. Anyway, so that worked out really well. Okay, so this is my UX crash course. You feel free to stop, ask questions. There's all good stuff. I'm just going to run through, and again, I'm a researcher, right? Like my school, all graduate school was through the lens of research. I did a lot of work in simulators and combines for John Deere, and then anything I could work in video game related was what I want to do. So that's my lens as I work through all of this. Xbox research, has anybody here gone to participate in a study for Xbox research? A few of you? Oh, that's fantastic. Oh, now I should do the dual purpose, and you can go sign up online to participate. Yeah, that's fantastic. So we have our labs at Studio D on campus. So if you've not been there before, we have a centralized research team for Xbox, and the ops team has all of our lab and infrastructure in Studio D. So if you go, we have lots of tests, lots of labs, and I'll show a couple pictures, but this is where we're housed. These are my research interests. You can take a peek at them. They're varied and broad. Video games made the list because I made this slide before I started at Xbox. The thing that I did that was kind of unique that you might not run into people doing every day are different psychophysiological measures. So that's EDA, heart rate, a bunch of different stuff. My old demo I used to do when I'd give these types of talks was I'd have myself hooked up and in real time stream my heart rate and my skin conductance. You'd be like, he's getting nervous. He's going to crack soon. Watch him fall. It didn't happen. So no, I don't do that type of work as much anymore. Also, it's like a little hand wavy. So if you want to get a good way to have somebody have a non-committal answer that's not a political non-committal answer, you can talk about biofeedback and research. Anyway, so these are some different things I get. I like my major influences. This is definitely a driver. It's not just like, oh, look at my family. But this is an old slide because my son is not in it. I feel real bad. I should update the photo. My son's 2. Doesn't speak well for me. But it's a big deal because I play a lot of, the way I play games, the way I play board games are really centered around my constraints in my life. And so if anybody here has kids, I'm sure many of you do, you get that you can't always go out and play whatever you want for all hours of the night. So you have to start playing games that are tighter, like time loops, right? So if I want to play a game, it's typically like a round or two of Rocket League, right? As opposed to going and playing 4 hours in Skyrim or something. And then you have all these other TV, movies, blah, blah. So you just some ideas of who I am. So you guys are aware of UX, which is great. And do you know have you guys talked about usability testing? Yeah? So nodding, nose, okay. Cool, we'll talk a little bit about that. Have you guys seen Grandma's Boy? Yeah? Okay, so that's my desperation plea. So sometimes people are a little lighter on the usability side in the UX world. So if you've not heard of it, Grandma's Boy is way one end of the spectrum of QA, right? Like looking for bugs is sort of one end, and then on the far other end, you have got academic, future-facing research that's like 20 years out. So that's sort of the wide berth. Within Microsoft specifically, we have a thing called the RVC, which is the Research Virtuous Cycle. And so this is something that we think is really important, and it's what drives us to continue to look at research within the life cycle of different products and different things, as opposed to just like, this is where we plug in. You're going to come to me with a request that says, I need to figure out how people are going to use this new version of our mail app, or I want to look at how calendaring works. You can do that. It's really sort of reactive. RVC, the idea behind our RVC is that you're within the planning process, you're helping design like the constraints, giving recommendations, and you're moving throughout the product lifecycle. So it looks like this. We build knowledge to be able to, you activate that knowledge so people can take action on it, and you're trying to measure, see that you're getting like the data science-y quarter over here, like measuring to see how well your recommendations are taking place and what impact it's having. Integrate those types of things. I don't know all the buzzwords in here. Integrate into the process so you can see how that affects the process plan moving forward, and then you research and you keep going. So a lot of times as researchers, we get stuck in this quarter, like we really like our world, the research quarter. Be like, we're gonna go do a thing, we're gonna go do it really well, and then we sort of go back to our hidey hole, and you come back to us with a new request, and we go do it, and we go do it really well. But we're trying to, like, it's better to think more comprehensively about things, so you wanna be thinking this whole life cycle. So this is a very Microsoft UX user research site, and this specifically comes from the Windows, Xbox researchy family of researchers. So within usability and UX and sort of the nuance and distinction between the two, usability, if you've heard of it, you have an idea. I like to think about usability as sort of like, does it work? So there's this functional component of usability. It's very much, could you do it and how quickly, and there's some performance aspects to it. Versus UX is sort of the whole umbrella. And the reason I like to have this, like have these two pit against each other almost, is that the two terms get conflated all the time. And I would say that like tech research UX is really a lot of acronym interchangeable soup. And when you go into the UX world, if you go to a UX conference, the buzzwords and everything sort of, they change, but a lot of the underlying meaning is the same. So I think it's meaningful, and this is like my pro-life tip as you're going to do interviews and you're going to do your own talks. Have an opinion about something. So my opinion I like to share, and this is old now, but I like to show that, hey, I didn't just go and read, I didn't read the first UX books I got in my hand. I didn't read Lean UX and then come in here and try to interview. I thought a little bit about it and actually have a perspective on how usability is different from UX. So like I specifically use this type of slide when I was doing interviews and when I was doing different types of talks. But the idea here is that you've thought a little more seriously about it, and the words aren't just all interchangeable alphabet soup. So anyhow, everything's just not QA, right? That's the grandma's boy end of things. In UX, are you familiar with the Nielsen-Norman group? Jacob Nielsen, Don Norman, are we fans? Oh, we're gonna have to become fans. So okay, I see some nodding, some subtle nodding, like, got you. NN Group, Nielsen-Norman Group is a research firm, right, that they would happily sell you their research, but they have most of their best findings are just published online. And this is a group that's specializing in user research, and they're looking specifically at productivity software. So Don Norman is the dude who wrote The Design of Everyday Things. If you haven't read that, that's like seminal HCI reading. Okay, perfect. Yeah, that's like that's like 101 HCI reading, right? So this is his group, and then Jacob Nielsen's like OG Web 1.0 original researcher, has tons of foundational research, high-level guidelines and heuristics on how you should do best web practices. So these are names that you'll see in recurring. Anyway, so Nielsen-Norman Group talks about user experience as being this all-encompassing aspect of the experience, right? All across all services and products. Where usability, it feels so much more dry. It's like, this is straight up ISO standard talk. So if you're not familiar with ISO standards, the United States and then greater like international bodies have these ISO standards, these international standards, and we have some on usability. They exist across the whole, like across the industry for a bunch of different stuff with electronics and whatever. And there's just like these big binders. There's one specifically on usability, and it's about measuring the effectiveness and the efficiency and satisfaction for a person, for a user, to achieve a specific goal. Like it just feels very clinical. So again, demonstrating like usability is very much like, does it work? A specific thing in UX is sort of the all-encompassing umbrella, and usability lives underneath it. All right, flying through this stuff. Methods. Okay, so like any good researcher, I have to my favorite part of a new challenge or a question that comes up is when someone says, "Hey, can we figure out how well people like this and what's motivating them to take this action?" Of course, the answer is always yes. and how long will it take to figure that answer out? It depends, right? So we have this nice broad spectrum of methods. You can think of methods in a bunch of different ways. I'm going to show you 2 ways. This way is the qual to quant, and it's not strictly this like single continuum. There's a bunch of overlap, but this is a nice way to sort of simplify it, flatten out this list of methods. On the quant side, right, you have null hypothesis significance testing, right? So this is like classic, let's do stats and like parametric stats at that, right? So you want to do t-tests and regression and all those good things. If you're a Bayesian fan, fantastic, right? So these are all ways that are, if you go down the stats path, it's useful to have a point of view and think about how you're going to answer, is something better than something else? Did it perform differently? That's where you get into these types of stats, and it's nice to know how you're going to tackle those types of problems. And then you move toward the qual end of the spectrum. You get UX metrics, so they're not quite as robust. Typically, you can still do the same type of testing, but they don't feel as rigorous most of the time when you're reporting. But these UX metrics are performance things, so these are very much in the usability, like time on task, error rate, satisfaction, this type of stuff, efficiency, abandonment, yeah. So these are all things that you can set up as standard measures to have as you look at a particular task. So you can ask somebody to do a particular thing and then measure all of these across multiple sessions. Behavioral coding is in the middle, and I feel like it's a sweet spot for a lot of research, and specifically if you're trying to do research on the cheap, because behavioral coding allows you to get some numbers to go with something that's very much a behavioral thing. So my example of this is when I'm in the lab, like a better example is when I was in the lab previously looking at simulator research. And so I'm from Iowa, right? I'm doing a lot of research with John Deere. We have people driving this combine simulator, and they're going down the road, right? And then we're trying to do if they're seeing traffic oncoming or not, and we're trying to see if they look. Well, if they go into the field, and we're trying to look to see as they're unloading, their auger swings out over the grain cart. And if we're doing automated augers, we're trying to see, do they look, do they test it, do they trust it, right? So measuring trust and automation is not trivial, right? So behavioral coding is something where we can count the number of times they look because the stimulus that they're checking on is actually far enough to the right they have to turn their head. So we can actually see if they turn their head and how many times. And all you do is sit with your code book and say, checks by turning head or whatever, turns head right. So every time they do that, you go check, 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 check. And now all of a sudden you start to have this, like if you look at a histogram of this over time, right? The checks start to decrease as the machine continues to operate. And it's going to operate perfectly because it's all fake in a simulator, but they need to check it less and less, and you can show that with data. So you can do a bunch of really cool things with behavioral coding, and that's where you start getting the numbers to say people checked less with this treatment as opposed to this treatment they were checking more with some instability and variable driving or something. So anyway, that's why I have that sitting in the middle. So it's behavioral that's sort of emergent that you put numbers to. Think aloud protocol is where a lot of people are familiar. Have you guys done like usertesting.com or any of these, like you have like a task and you record as you think aloud as you're doing this? It's okay. You have to raise your hand and it's fine. I know. I don't want to admit that I'm the one that goes and does that either. But if you go to usertesting.com, it's actually something I would encourage. You go and sign to be a participant and you get studies like someone like me might prescribe. So I might send you a website and say, hey, you want to reset your password using account.microsoft.com, which is something I covered research for. And so as I do that, I would see how people would approach that problem, right? So they'd go to account.microsoft.com, we'd give them some fake credentials, so they use their own. There's a variety of reasons why you would or would not do those. And then we see where they go. Like, are they going to go to up to the top right corner where there's a face and they click it for their profile, or are they going to try to look under the security settings? And so as they're doing those things, you're reminding them to think aloud. So I think I'm going to click on my picture up at the top right because I'm pretty sure my settings are under the picture, right? So the think aloud protocol is just helping people elicit why they're taking the specific action that they're taking. There's some problems that you can get into that with a bunch of nuance, but the high level is if you're trying to measure these things, these like time on task bits, you don't want to conflate them with this stuff, right? Because if you're having someone think aloud, it starts increasing the numbers here. So you sort of have to pick if you're going to do performance or this more qual explanatory bit, something to think about. And then interview, right? We're all familiar with interviews. There's definitely an art to it. The more you do it, the easier it gets, but that's definitely on the way qual end. And you can get into some coding schemas with interviews too, like 7 out of 10 participants mention this specific behavior, this specific concern they had, and so you can start putting numbers to it. So sort of the spectrum. As you look at the like high-level qual versus quant, just in case it's unclear at this point, quant is this example here, like only 1 person in 30 take the free ice cream. Interesting, right? And then you have the more qualitative method. Is this why? Yeah, what did you feel when you saw the free ice cream? Excited, a little scared, right? And why was that? So you have like press, right? So it's the qual, you're trying to get the underlying reasons why. So that's sort of the high level qual quant. So another way to think about methods would be this cost spectrum. And this is not always apparent, but you quickly run into it when you're playing in a constrained arena. So I'm very fortunate today because my constraints are not the same constraints that they were 5 or 6 years ago. So as a researcher at Microsoft, I don't run into the I can't get a person, or we can't test this this particular thing, or I don't have the tools available to me. Those aren't my constraints. Typically my constraints are time, or like some type of security, or if you guys are aware of GDPR, y'all got your emails in May that said from every service, like, we're updating our privacy. That happened in May, right, for GDPR for every company. Now, well, that really did, implications are sort of far and wide. For researchers, it's a big pain in the butt because it means we can't keep your data for more than 30 days. So it's really hard to track longitudinally if we had these lists. So we wanted to know, these are good participants for this type of thing, not has to get thrown out unless it's anonymized appropriately. Anyway, this vanity. For the cost side, those are the typical constraint though that we have now is just how do we source those people. But in the sort of cost with time and combo money, you could think about the lower cost being heuristic review. HITS is an internal thing, sorry. HITS is our research database at Microsoft that there's some fun talks online about, but it's our own way of storing research because you have this problem where you do research, send out the report, and it gets lost in email. But regardless, a low cost thing would be like a heuristic review. Bonus points to somebody who can explain what a heuristic review is. That's okay. I trust that a few of you know, and you just don't want to. Okay, you make me look bad. I see. Heuristic review is something where you might bring me a product, or bring a researcher or a product on your team, and you'd go through it sort of meticulously, and you'd give them feedback based on principles. So if you bring me a new version of your mail client, and I see that you have a hamburger menu button that's 3 lines at the top with no icon, I would say, is this a hamburger icon? Are we trying to invoke a menu of some sort? We'd say, what does the user need? We always have to drive what the user need is, the underlying user need for something like that. And if it's to get them to find extra settings under the hamburger menu, then we'd want to put an icon, put a label on that icon that says menu. So definitely don't do the 3 slotted lines for a menu alone. Hamburger menus are bad. But that's a really low cost way of doing work. So we could just review things by looking at best practices. The cognitive walkthrough would be in that same vein, but as opposed to me just a researcher pulling out these things that are best practices, we'd actually be going through the tasks ourselves. So it's kind of expert review is another word that works for a cognitive walkthrough, but it's typically you've worked with a team for a little bit and they trust you, so then you're able to start going through and they're trusting your gut instinct, because if you can give them some feedback and make some changes earlier on, it's cheaper than building it out and testing with real people. Usability online, so that's the user testing. So that's if we want to get sort of a cheap way of doing it. I think usertesting.com, to get an individual to, if I want to put a website in front of you and give you a set of tests to look at, it's something like $50 a person, which is really super cheap for a usability session for 15 minutes of their time. But it depends on what you're trying to get out of it, but that's definitely sort of on the cheaper end. You can run dedicated lab studies, right? If you're going to have people come in and recruit them, I think we pay between $50 to $150 for a session. So if you want to have a specific problem looked at with a specific set of people, say you want IT decision makers, people who are in charge of doing your IT security within your within small businesses, you're paying them $500 an hour, right? Because there's very few of them and their time is worth a lot. So the dedicated lab studies are getting more expensive. And then large surveys can be super expensive. I've heard bizarre $250,000 for these mass market. This is where you look at Newzoo is for video games, and there's Forrester for consumer and business products. These are different firms that do large market research studies. I have a lot of respect for market research because I think it's really tough work to go do these big general surveys, and many of you have probably filled them out or taken some form of them. But there's a lot of goodness to be gained from that, and that's typically where you get these cuts like men are more likely by 3% to blah than women, or you're looking at some other segmentation that's by income or by education or whatever, right? The problem, for me, the tough part with that work is that when you're going out to do those types of surveys and you're putting those reports together, they're not really done with a specific audience in mind typically. It's you go to do the work that seems broadly applicable, and then you're trying to sell it after the fact, so it can be tough. But they're very expensive to commission on a one-off. So that's sort of this spectrum of small to large and also with cost. So heuristic review, cognitive walkthrough, so talk about those a little bit. UI tenets and traps, and I'll show those in a second. So tenets and traps. If you go to UITraps.com, you can actually buy these cards, and we brought them when I spoke before. But there's this little deck of knowledge that we have, and it's looking at all the things that we know that are good practices, the tenets, and we try to point out all the traps that exist within those tenets, and you want to avoid those. So this is what they look like. If you go to UITraps.com, I'm trying to sell you them, but I'm sort of trying to sell you them, I guess. I have no share in it. I think we sell them at cost, but I won't joke you. This is the best. I think they're $30 or something. It's the best $30 you probably spend, because it's like all the UX books compressed into this little deck of cards, and you take those cards and you look through, is my product understandable? Is it comfortable? There's a lot of habituation that you find problems with, but the example would be like a good one that's understandable that comes up is effectively invisible element or invisible element. You might have something on your screen that's really critical to your actual task being completed, right? So if I'm asking you to reset your password and you can't find where your personal settings are within it, it might be that it's a button off to the right-hand side of the screen, but it's barely visible. That would be an effectively invisible element. I mean, it's there, you can see it, but nobody will ever look at it, and there's no reason for them to draw their eye to it. So then you can take a card like that says, hey team, this particular element that's really critical to our task, no one's finding it, and it's because it's an effectively invisible element. And so these are the most common traps that we found across all of UX, typical UX, especially within productivity software. Excuse me. I know there's some game-specific ones, but these are the ones that are more broadly applicable, and they're also available. So anyway, that's my plug for an external thing, and they're super useful. When we go to do, as an example of something that we do, I do one maybe every month, it's realistic. And some people find them to be a lot more helpful, so they might do them every other week. I know there's one group that does them every week. But they'll sit down with their team, and before their design is even finalized, right, it might just be the sketch, the low-fidelity sketch version of whatever they're thinking about doing. The researcher and the designers will sit down in a room every week or every other week or whatever happens to be, and they'll take these cards, and everybody has their own deck, and they'll go through them together and look for these problems. And by capturing the low-hanging fruit, it just saves a lot of time and energy down the road. So it's a huge time saver. So if you take nothing else from me today, it's valuable to have a high-level set of guiding principles and best practices in UX. You can get these lists. If you search UX best practices, there's a dozen different lists that pop up. But I'll make a plug for this one that's from our group. It's just super good. My lab that I started in was this. So this is at Iowa State. We have a really cool lab that's all the VR stuff, and if you wanted to do UX, you went upstairs to this old decommissioned office that had, it looks a lot bigger than it really was in the photo, because I think I went to opposite ends of the room to take the picture, but it's just a single office space that we converted. But you could do a lot with a little. I ran as many studies as anybody else, and then as you're thinking about how you want to become involved in other people's projects, the way that I gained a ton of experience in a wide breadth of different things to look at was by injecting this lab into everybody else's studies. So what you'll find as you go through and take classes especially is that you'll have tons of class projects where you're making a thing. If you want to be the person who's doing sort of say you get a deck of those cards and you want to be the person who does applies the tenets and traps review for all your classes projects, it's worth it to volunteer your time to do the extra hour with each group, because you gain a ton of experience. Now you can talk about the mail application versus the menu labeling system versus the online ordering form and the commerce platform. Everyone will have these different projects, but instead of just having your experience to one, this is your cheat sheet of having experience to everything, and you can talk about it because you did the work. So that's my personal pitch if you like research. But in this lab, we had an eye tracker that was set up permanently. That's on this machine, and then we did this is my laptop, right? But I was running some of the real-time psychophysiological measurements, so I actually was wearing it and took a picture. So this is skin connected or something on the screen. But all these different methods that I had within the lab, they sort of it's a big tool belt, and you could sort of see which ones would help where in different projects. So I was able to go and do different types of reviews for flight simulators and then driving simulators, simulator sickness, virtual reality sickness, a bunch of different stuff. So in our lab at Microsoft, in this case, they were testing something and they were watching them use it in real time. So in this one-to-one session, they're able to see the person use the product, watch them over the monitor, and then talk to them over the mic. You might have this, as I did. I had this initial reaction when I saw how a real lab was set up with the one-way glass or the monitor, right? I thought, it's kind of impersonal. I don't really want to go there. I feel I'd rather come sit next to you and work on something and talk to you and be personal. This abstraction from the good or bad or the personal interaction helps in getting consistency with your findings, because I find that when I sit down and talk with people, I get pretty like, hey, you're doing a good job, right? And then a little too much congratulatory, and then I see this look on their face when it's really shitty, and they're like, I don't want to disappoint you. This is pretty good, right? And I'm like, I can't tell you how to feel. Oh God, it's all falling down. But if I was just sitting behind the glass, right, it'd be way more neutral, and I wouldn't have to have that relationship, which is sad. I'm not missing that point. That's very sad. I'm like, it's better to have no human connection in this case, trust me. No, but abstracting that really does help with the consistency of the findings. But there's a variety of reasons why you'd want to do it, why you want to sit next to somebody or not. In this case, it does help with just being more consistent, and it has the side perk. If you have the person who made it, they can come into the room, give feedback, ask questions in real time, and also, if something's not working correctly, you can be like, 1 second, turn, what's going on? It's broken. Please help me, right? You have to go steal it. You're like, well, I'll be right back. And then you can have the person who built it help you fix it. So that's really helpful. So in this case, this is literally a shot of us doing something like that in the lab, which is a very common setup. In the playtest lab, which is the other end of the spectrum, this is, again, in our labs for Xbox research. We bring people in, and as you can see here, there's a bunch of people sitting at the different stations. So if you've come in, you may have, so the people that came in before, you probably were either in the room where you were alone, talking to the person with the omniscient voice and the Wizard of Oz setup, or you were here in the playtest lab, sitting next to other people, having a similar experience to everyone else. The benefit then of the playtest lab is that you can bring in a bunch of people, have them have the same experience over a set amount of time, and then because each one of these stations has its own computer, you can interject survey questions whenever you want. So for example, when you're doing a study, you might want somebody to play a 20-minute vertical slice of a particular video game, and then after that 20 minutes is up, regardless of their progress or whatever, you might say, all right, everybody, set your controllers down. Now I want you to turn to the computer and please fill out the survey for the next 5 minutes, right? And so then you can get immediate feedback as to the experience they just had. And when you have 35 people, you're talking about a sample of, you're doing a bunch of 1 to 5 Likert scale questions, right? If you have 35 people and you do a few different trials, you're starting to talk about something that you can put numbers to and where you actually could start doing some stats on it. So as you build up that library of knowledge about what a good score is and a bad score is, this is the way you have to do it, is being systematic, clean, and having a large N. And the best way to do that is by having a lot of people do it simultaneously. Sort of some behind the scenes, just so as you're thinking about different future career paths and things you could work on. In this specific case, the person moderating the study can be a range of individuals. Xbox Research has its own lab infrastructure, like I mentioned, right? And in this case, the moderators they're a team of people who are very good at moderating, and this is what they do. I used to moderate all my own studies, but now at this point, there are people who work in the lab to do this, and so we work together as a team where we might sit down to design the study. I might draft up some questions, they might review them, or vice versa. We all work together. They'll run it, I might come in to check, right? And it's sort of this unit, but that way when you have 6 of these sessions, I might go to the first one to make sure things are going really well, and then the next 5 sessions will sort of almost be automatic because everybody's familiar and we've gotten it down. Anyhow, so there's a whole system here, and the reason I'm mentioning it here for this audience is that as you're thinking about different ways to plug into, if you're thinking about research, you're thinking about getting into games, this is a way that the people who participate here are typically people who have helped. One, they've already been lab assistants for college or in different labs or ongoing, or they've participated in class projects where they've done this type of stuff. Or they're not looking to do any, they might not want to go to X number, they want to grad school for X number of reasons, but you still want to be in video games. This is a great avenue, and then you can do internal work. So just as a thought there. And then my other, the reason for mentioning it is that I always recommend you get involved. So if there's an opportunity to work on a project outside of class, volunteer in a lab, et cetera, those are all really good things. That's where I gained the vast majority of my experience prior to work. Okay, so then the takeaway from these two things, these are and there's a lot more methods, right? We sort of danced around a bunch of them earlier. These are the 2 that see the most use. So usability on the left, do you get it? Do you understand how to use it? What's going on here? Do we find a big problem? And there's a bunch of good research saying that if you Google, if you Google it, if you search online with whatever browser or search engine you choose to use, there it is. Oh, ew. No, sincerely, if you do a search online though, right? If you go and Google the 5 reasons to test with 5 people, there's a bunch of opinions why you would or would not want to test something with 5 individuals, and that number goes up and down. But if you go down this path of Jeff Sorrow's the guy's name, and he sort of does UX stats, and he does a bunch of different stuff with that, you'll see the breakdown of how the underlying math is. if you test with 5 people, you will discover at least, well, you'll discover 80% of the major issues available. So the idea is that test with a low end of people, catch most of the big problems. So anyway, that's sort of the usability side of it, because you don't want to be running individual sessions all the time. And then when you're looking for the attitudinal behavioral things, like how many people did this action, how many people did not have fun or did have fun, that's in playtest where you have a larger N, right? Okay, so again, just to like sort of recap this, heuristic review, no users involved, like small meaning 0 for your sample size here. HITS is a proxy for go search on Google Scholar, right? Or any of the, you do Nielsen Norman group or whatever, right? Go look at your favorite UX outlet. You did the work. You're actually going to go through it yourself and recommend some expert recommendations based off of your known principles. I might have a few people take a look at it in a small usability session online even. Dedicated lab study, I have a bunch of people, all the way to large surveys with thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. So that's the run through. That's sort of like the first piece, and honestly the more interesting piece. Does anybody have questions or thoughts or things that are burning? Yeah.
Do you do A/B testing, like new designs?
Yeah. So A/B testing is a really common way to compare 2 or more. Like you can set up infinite permutations, right? But A/B is really common within the data science community. So typically when people think of A/B testing, you think of like I've got version A of an interaction or of an interface and version B of an interface, and I'm going to flight it out to a group of people so they'll randomly get one or the other, and you see how they perform. So like it's really common in commerce to see if people are going to add the add-on item in your shopping cart, like where do you place the like upsell button? Like as soon as you click continue, or finish shopping or complete purchase or whatever, do you pop it up there and say, hey, for only whatever, add this add-on, or do you wait until they're right at the end of the checkout flow before you complete purchase? There's a, hey, but now you can interject, so you could like A/B test your interstitial. That type of stuff happens all the time, so it's a good question. It happens a lot less in user research, and so I probably did a terrible job of describing this because I didn't describe it. There's a whole continuum of places that you would gain insights from, right? That you would gain information about how people are using your stuff or how they want to use your stuff. And you can think of this, there's a bunch of different channels. The ones that seem most prominent to me today are the market research people who are figuring out these high, like how are people using things? What are their beliefs and attitudes sort of about stuff? Then you have the user research group like we are. This is where we're sort of drilling down into personal, like how did they do it? Was it difficult? How difficult? What are the big problems? And then you have the data science community, which are instrumenting live actual websites or apps or products or whatever, right? And like a lot of this is moving to stuff as a service. So if you're like playing mobile games on your phone, those are all like hooked up to backend services for games, right? So you can see like which variation of the color item was purchased more, or what was the title that worked better. So this data science stream, the user research stream, and the market research stream, and there's different pieces that fit in everywhere else. Market research typically runs the A/B testing. And then you can definitely, the thing that becomes cool about A/B testing is that if you just have a random idea, like I don't see how this performs, you can like just send it out to like 0.1% of your population or whatever, the people that go to traffic to your website, and you see how that tests. So, and you can just keep doing that over and over again. I know that's true for most any website today. Having apps instrumented is a different thing. But yeah.
On the way, what stage you usually design it? Like on a which stage of development? When it's just architecture design, or like on the latest when it's almost done?
Which one you do A/B test?
Yes.
So, of course it depends, like a good research answer. People end up doing it a lot later. I would definitely recommend trying to do it earlier. The reason why it almost always happens later is that A/B testing typically happens with live product. So that means somebody had to take the time to actually build it. And so by the time you've had an engineer sit down and build something out, you've already invested a lot in it and it's passed a lot of checks. So A/B testing, from my perspective, is typically done at the end. If you had a means to flight it earlier, you would be able to. And I've seen some really cool ideas around doing like, let's send out this prototype, this sort of like wireframey prototype to people, and you could do some of it there, but you'd never get the big data A/B testing that people think of with data science. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah.
What's the lowest fidelity thing you've had to run through the
paper prototypes?
paper prototypes?
So in this case, and I can show examples of it, but fidelity in this case is like how professional or how finished a product looks. Typically, we test stuff that's really polished. Personally, my opinion is you should test with earlier product, but there's a lot of reasons why you would or would not want to. I found that a lot of designers, like researchers have our pride wrapped up in different things. Designers have their pride wrapped up in how polished their product looks. This is not something exclusive to Microsoft. This is just true of most design I've worked with. This is not a knock on half the room, but like, as you go to build your stuff, it's okay to show your baby, and it's okay for people to tell you that it's ugly. And it's better to test it earlier than later, because you're going to spend weeks, hours of your life making every, I'm not going to even try to use a design word, a bezel, I don't know, something, a drop shadow will be added. That sounds a bit worse. Okay, so you'll do something to make your design great, right? But what ends up happening is the underlying functionality doesn't change, and so you find problems with it. You're like, sorry, those last 2 weeks are, they didn't do anything. So I've tested paper prototypes. I specifically tested them for with a purpose to test paper prototypes to force people to do that. What I find actually works really well when you're testing functional, like here's a big change. We're going to have people try to do this new task within our app game browser, wireframe. That ends up to be really simple, and mostly because the tools are online and really low access. So have you guys used like Just in Mind Prototyper, Acture, Balsamic? These ringing bells? Yeah? See some nodding? Yes! So if you go online and do some research, online prototyping, right, you'll find a bunch of tools. A bunch of them are free because you're students. You actually have access for full-blown Acture and Just in Mind Prototyper. Those are both free to you, and they're fully loaded, featured prototyping suites. And those even have web hosting platforms that you can then tie into telemetry, so you could do A/B testing on your prototype. So yeah, I'll show some pictures, but earlier is better. Earlier is better. Show the paper prototype, have people point to it. Where would you click on this picture? And have people point to it, and you're like, they don't get it. Damn it. But that's okay. Sorry. Other questions or thoughts?
Do you split people on the age categories, like more older and younger people?
So, yeah, I'm just gonna say, just assume I say it depends to every answer, right? Okay, it depends. Age is not typically something that I've found particularly useful to cut on. If you go to market researchers, they'll talk about pivoting. So like you have pivot tables in Excel. That's like you want to pivot on this metric. Age is not particularly useful for most of the things I'm looking at. That said, big caveat, recently I've been looking at big like mass market consumer products in which you sort of do one size fits all stuff. So solving core functionality is not something I really want to index on age too heavily. Take that, separate that piece of your mind. There's a ton of applications in which you actually do segment on age. There's specific applications that are made for older people. There's specific applications that are made for kids. Like I did family research for a while. The software that I tested for kids and having that permission structure for how they interact with their parents, that's not something I would want to test with just the parents. Like I have to have the younger kids test it. So it all depends on the application. Yeah. It's really hard to recruit kids, by the way. The secret, no surprise to anyone here, right? The secret to recruiting children is that you recruit their parents, and the requirement of the parent is that they bring the child. So that's how you do that when you go forward. There's another hand over here. I think it was, no? It was the child question. You were going to ask about child testing. That was the answer. Okay, cool. Wait for time before I take us. 40, okay. All right, so we have some time. Again, feel free to raise your hand or stop me. I want to show you the wide breadth of other things that are available sort of in UX research world. Big picture, you can just drink some of this stuff in. These are big pieces that I would talk about when I would teach UX methods in my course. So I talk about things that were strategy oriented versus methods versus tools. And the reason that I broke those out specifically is that tools was the class that I was teaching. I went week by week to show how you did eye tracking for a whole week. We did prototyping for a whole week and got deep into the fidelity game. We go through and we do how to do think aloud protocols, we do usability testing, we do survey design. So all these tools, all these things are different tools in the tool belt for different methods, and you have a reason for doing them at different points within your scope. So something that will happen as you do research, my lens, as you work in the UX area, something that will happen is that you'll have a good idea that you think is a good idea, and whoever you're selling it up to, or whoever is deciding that it's their time or money that they're going to be spending, they might not agree with you, so you'll have different strategies that you'll need to undertake to get them to see your point of view. One of the best interview questions I was asked was how you convince somebody who doesn't agree with you of a change, a design decision change. And of course I was like, oh, this is simple. I show them the data. My beautiful graphs and figures will convince them, and they will see the light, and we will all come together on my great idea, right? Of course, that's of course how it works. And of course, that's not how it works, right? Somebody has an idea of how something should work because their kid did it that way, and their anecdotal experience is going to override all the data in the world for you. So you have to have tons of backup data. So the answer to that question, I'm handing you all my secrets, damn it. The answer to the question when somebody asks you though, and how to strategize appropriately and convince someone, you start with I'm someone who's thought long and hard about this in the field, and I think this would be a great idea, and here's the little list of references from this beautiful card that says, this is an invisible element, we need to move it. They don't believe you, so then you bring it into the lab and you get feedback and you show people, like, hey, I have some data, 82% of the people that we tested missed this button, so this is not great. And they're like, well, the people you tested, who takes online tests anyway, right? And you're like, oh, okay. How about this? How about I show you these beautiful statistics to go with it, and I will show you a heat map, and I will show you everywhere they clicked but your interactive element. And they're like, well, do we know what resolution their browser was? Oh, okay, all right. So like, you go down this path, right? What you end up doing is you get a video of someone struggling to find the thing that they're looking for, and you're like, look at the pain. Look at the pain on their face. And you bring them into the lab, and so then you go back to that slide where we're sitting in the lab together, and it's have you guys watched Silicon Valley? Yeah, see, okay, so sorry, I can go down this path. There's the episode where Richard does a focus group, and they're trying to test how people are using his app, and no one understands it, and he's like banging on the glass, like, no, it's not how you do it! And he ends up going out into the focus group teaching for an hour how to use his app because it's so bad and broken. Like, that's what you want to avoid. So if you can get to that level of pain, they're like, we might need to make a change. Okay, all right, and so you can convince someone. So that's the secret though, like you start with the low effort, based on research that other people have done who are smarter than I, say this is the problem, we saw it, here's the data, there's the stats, here's the example and the pain, right? So anyway, that's your tiering question. I call that the shoe hierarchy for what it's worth because of the guy who asked me. Very smart man. All right, so strategy, methods, tools. So there's your big picture of UX. And when I try to convince people, which clearly I don't have to convince anybody here, you're all on board and bought in, that's fantastic. But if you weren't, I would say, hey, there's good reason why you'd want to do this and invest in doing a little bit of research. If you were to do that, you could avoid things like being an American automaker in the 70s when you argued against what people wanted against the market research. Like, I don't think people want bigger and slower cars with worse fuel economy. Yeah, I don't think you understand it's pleather. So that's that one. Like Microsoft and Sega in the 90s. Like again, like I made this. Like these are things independent of my current employment. Like we had Microsoft's business in the 90s. You can go look at it and hear these read retrospectives. Right. Microsoft was very much complacent. Sega was very much complacent in different ways, and they had different people come in and take parts of their market share. In 2000s, holy crap! Is anybody familiar with Epic health software? You guys know this outfit? So if you do anything in medicine, you will become, if you go to a hospital today, chances are good that when the nurse or the doctor clicking on the portal next to you, it will have a little red symbol in the top right corner that says Epic Systems specifically. That's a little software firm out of Madison, Wisconsin. They now own the health software market because everyone else had, there was no, like, it was all on-prem, unique, or paper and a bunch of envelope. Like, people, I'm 30, so I'm not, well, like, I can't say I'm old or something, but do you remember going to the office and it was like the wall of manila envelopes that your doctor would pull out your file? Yeah, there was a world where that was the best system, right? And so anything that usurped that was better. Epic is making a ton of money right now. So if you want to work in Madison, Wisconsin, it's a nice place. Epic Systems. I heard that you get burned out pretty quick though. Anyway, so that's healthcare, accounting, business software. Those are all things that take a turn. You also have things like Intuit makes TurboTax, right? Like that's another great example. Like why would I go do taxes when I can just do TurboTax? Fun fact, if you want a good research project, I'm just giving you this one for free, do seasonal user experience. There's a bunch of software that only is used seasonally or annually or even less if you can find the right example. Tax software is a perfect example of one that's doing it right. The opportunity for you is defining it as a genre and writing the paper on best practices for it and introducing why you would and where place soft learning events when people go back to a thing that they haven't done in 9 months. I did a lot of egg work, so when you go to do harvest and it's only once a year, farmers forget how to use the touch interface that they just bought and they reluctantly used because their son told them to. So that's a problem. All right, so is UX worth it? You can go look. There's a bunch of information on ROI, so this return on investment. The big picture is do it earlier. You'll save a bunch of money. Researchers are seen as a cost center typically because we don't make product, so we don't sell something. So you have to sell your ROI in other ways. How you do that is by showing if you save all the engineering time that it would take to build something, watch it fail, reiterate on it, if you just had done a little bit of research in the beginning, that's how you show your ROI. That's how the business of research is run today. Yeah, and there's a bunch of stuff there. Okay, and then if you like You guys familiar with, so human factors is another word that's going to slide in here. Human factors is check in time, not bored of you. Human factors is another discipline that's adjacent to human-computer interaction. Human factors is older. It's typically seen as the ergonomics. That's the other name that you'll see it pop up as. Ergonomics research area. So typically they're doing physical research. So like the medical industry and all their devices is human factors and ergonomics typically. So if you go to, again, I'm from the Midwest, if you go to 3M in Minnesota, the Minnesota Mining Company, that group does a ton of human factors on physical, like adhesive testing and abrasion, and they want to test to see what the grit is on a particular grade of sandpaper, right? Like that type of stuff. That's all human factors. And there's also human factors at Microsoft. They work on the physical hardware. So there's a group of human factors engineers and researchers who work on the devices, right? If you go to, so that's sort of my make you aware of human factors. Human Factors International and HFES is their conference. They have this great infographic. You can click the link and it shows you this. It does like one of these fancy drawing things, and you zoom out and the picture becomes clear and it's obvious. Yeah, that's this thing. But it's great and it shows you the ROI of research. So when you're looking at how you actually do your research, it's typically nice to have a model, right? So if you're looking at the Booth model, you're looking at things like what you want to try to understand, why do people even care? We've talked about pieces of this along the way. And you want to have something that sort of is, is tangible, you can touch, like what's your claim, what are you trying to get at? And this is looking at what your hypothesis would be. So to do that, you have this whole model, yes, the Booth model, and you have a claim because of some type of reason based on this particular evidence, and you can start to slot in things here, right? Like we should make this change because of this reason based on the data that we're finding. And so if you start to use this formula to make your arguments, you'll find you're more successful than just I thought this was a good idea and or my mom said that she couldn't do it, right? So it's nice to have some structure and some systematic practice to it. You can break it down, and if we were going to do this as an exercise, you do a thing like you'd have a topic, you'd fill it out yourself, what you're interested in, and then you could fill it out in this framework, and we could start to investigate some questions that might be relevant to what you're actually interested in right now. So there's lots of stuff in UX, and specifically in UX research. You have to consider where you're at in development, where you're in the life cycle of the product, where you're trying to get buy-in, what's your strategy, blah, 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 blah. If you have access to users, there's a lot of things to consider. There's a bunch of tools. I'm going to go through all of them, but video tools, audio tools, like just recording, like I'm recording off the iPhone, right, for this. I did that in the field a ton. I would just record myself and take notes so I can go back and listen to the audio. And there's tools that allow you to take transcripts on like an iPad while the audio is recording, so you can actually touch a part of your notes and it will skip to that point in the audio, right? There's really handy stuff like that. Behavioral coding, like I talked about before, we're going to count every time somebody looks right. That's a piece of software I did, and it's called Null Observer. There's also a piece of software called Moray that's great for doing that. You can also do that to model different constructs like trust or cognitive load. Biometrics or psychophysiological measures, these are the other things I'm interested in that I used to do a lot of measurements with. I'm actually looking at doing it again now for stressing people out. So we want to see if we make you more stressed, can we show that objectively? And you'd use measures like EDA's electrodermal activity, previously known as galvanic skin response. So if you see GSR, that's what that means, but that's how sweaty you are because you actually start to have a lot of sweat rise in your skin. This is what my dissertation was on, so I'm going to stop before I bore you, but how sweaty you are is directly related to what your sympathetic nervous system levels are. Okay, so there's that. EDA, heart rate, blink rate, blood pressure, EEG. I don't like EEG. This is one where the electrodes are like strapped to your head and you put gel on. It feels very weird. And like if you go to a psychology lab and you volunteer and they give you like a slice of pizza and you're like looking at slide, don't clench your jaw, slide. Like EEG is a little tough. But the rest of them, also blood pressure you can't do. That's sort of low footprint. But blink rate, heart rate, EDA, you can get all those from like a band and a little webcam. Prototyping, we talked about that briefly. Data gathering, so there's lots of stuff. I will send you the slides. Prototyping, data gathering, these are just different survey tools. Do you guys use Qualtrics or do you use any survey platforms? These just like Google Forms or Microsoft Forms, they're free ones. Yeah. SurveyMonkey? Nice. SurveyMonkey, SurveyGizmo, Qualtrics, these are all good tools. SurveyMonkey, Gizmo, and Qualtrics are all popular right now for us. Qualtrics is what our group uses. I would say go use like Google Forms or Microsoft Forms, use whatever your ecosystem is, right? If you're in G Suite, use that. If you're in your Office, use that. But there's free ones, and they're great, and they're getting a lot better. That's how I do things. So it's a lot. It's expensive. It's really not that expensive. You can do UX on cheap. That's what that link tells you. The buy-in bit, there's a whole, I did a week on eye tracking as well. If you want to convince someone to do a thing, you can, if you don't have the data to do it, or maybe you have a little bit of the data, another way you can sort of bolster your sales pitch is to use sexy methods, and one of those is eye tracking. So showing a lot of heat maps and where people were looking is really neat. Show gaze replays and like, look where they looked, and they're looking where they looked, and everyone's like, this is amazing. You're like, I know, trust me. So eye tracking is a good one. So yeah, do it as early as possible. If you test at the end, it's hard to make impact when you test something at the end because it's probably already done and nobody wants to make changes based on whatever you said. Sorry, what's the other thing? Oh, yeah. So earlier is better. Yeah, earlier is better. It's an exercise. Here's the buzzword. It's an exercise in empathy. You really need to feel for everybody. And while that sounds sort of like, meh, there's a lot of truth in it. And if you just actually take the time to use the thing, you'd be surprised at the amount of people who don't use the thing they make regularly. If you take the time to do that, you actually gain a lot from it, right? Even just using it yourself. We're not going to go through this, but these are Jesse James Garrett's Elements of User Experience. I will, again, like his whole book, this is just abstracted from the book, but it talks about these are different things you can do. So evaluate and iterate. This is the bottom up, so I've just labeled it here. If you go through it, there's goals, the requirements. Oh yeah, feature creep is a great slide, right? Like, look at this. We just need one more thing on the tricycle. Information architecture, librarians are great information architects. If you have friends who are in library sciences, recruit them. They should be a great friend of yours and will continue to be. Interface design, here's an example of paper prototyping I sketched on a napkin, literally evaluating in the lab and iterating. That's that. Methods, prototyping review. Here's like wireframing, This is a crappier version, but it's sort of the same thing functionally, right? This is the wireframe. This is the finished thing. High fidelity. Paper prototyping. You have a website, a static UI at the top is in this middle of the envelope. You cut it out. You change the pages. They click here. You show the page that is that. That's a paper prototype. And there's some better looking wireframes. Test these. They're easy to make, and you can do them online. That's it. Sorry. Ran through the end of it. Questions? Thoughts? Oh, fantastic. Yeah. You need to run all of your IA through them. Yeah?
Did you focus test this presentation?
I absolutely did not. Because focus testing is built. No. I'm not a big fan of focus testing, but this is a combination of a couple different things I've done over a number of years. So yeah, thank you. Cool, yeah.
You mentioned people not using design, but do you guys participate in your own studies?
So do we participate in our own studies when it's difficult to find participants? Is that a question or no? Sure. Close enough? Good. That sounds good. Yes. We always pilot our own studies. So before we put them into the lab, we will help our friends out. We constantly do favors for each other by doing that. Yeah. And also you want to see how other people are structuring their studies. So it's a great use of time. Yeah. Cool. I'm happy to hang out and talk if you want to talk. Otherwise, thank you for letting me come.